We have learned a great deal about the scale and complexity of the global energy transition, the integrity of energy in our lives, and the current foundation that fossil fuel plays in our economy so far. But the question that sticks in my head is, where are we going to get the money to pay for the energy transition? Even keeping up with our growing energy demand is a challenge.
There's lots of needs in the global economy, in addition to the energy transition. Some companies are in a recession or low growth environments. These challenges are going to need public funds as well, like the recent U.S. infrastructure bill, as well as private or market capital. I read where it'll take trillions per year for all the categories of all the economies to meet their decarbonization goals. I agree. I'd like to know where all this money is going to come from.
We are already spending a lot of money for the current energy economy based on fossil fuels. Another challenge is to keep the lights on and manufacturing plants on while building other and new energy infrastructures. I know that there are carbon taxes in some places, and I would like to know how much they work. The topic of climate finance isn't something I've thought much about, so I'm glad to see that we have Brad Handler from the Sustainable Finance Lab of the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines on the episode to help us better understand where the public and private investments are going to come from.
I agree. I need a better background on finance in general. But I'm also excited that we're going to talk to Stacy Tarasio from Rebellion Energy Solutions to get an entrepreneur's perspective on putting together a new type of company to deal with carbon emissions from plugging orphan oil wells in a new market called the voluntary carbon offset market. Some of the solutions to the energy transition must come from new business models, as well as the traditional banks and government regulations. Well, welcome everyone to our episode on what is the cost of going green. Actually, I don't think anybody really knows for sure, and it really depends on the scope of the transition. But a recent study by the consultancy McKinsey Company said this. We found that if you look at those energy systems today, we're spending about $5.7 trillion annually on both high emission spending, which is kind of fossil fuel gas or internal combustion engine vehicles, and some low emission spending. Under a transition scenario over the next 3 decades, that 5.7 trillion would need to rise to 9.2 trillion a year. Also, about 75% of that 5.7 trillion is going to high emission spending. Going forward, it's going to have to flip. 75% would have to go to the low emission spending. So it's not just a scale up of capital, it's also a real allocation of capital. The finance system is integrating net zero with new financing commitments and mechanisms. But a $41 trillion funding gap remains right now. Our guest today is Brad Handler, head of the Energy Finance Lab at the Payne Institute for Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Brad was with us in season 1, and he's back to help us unravel the mysteries of the carbon offset trading market as a potential source for private funding for emissions reductions in the energy transition.
All right, well, welcome back, Brad, to the Future of Energy podcast. Thank you for coming back and for a return visit for season 2.
Well, thank you for having me on a second time. I guess the first time went okay, but it's a pleasure to come back.
Yeah, jumping right into it, can you introduce yourself? Give us a little personal and industry background and tell us what got you into the finance side of oil and gas.
Sure. Well, if I go, I guess more chronologically, about 25 years ago, I started with investment banks as an equity research analyst. And a little bit of happenstance and a little bit of background led me to the oil and gas sector, and specifically the oilfield services sector within that. And I did that happily for about 20 years, covering when you're a sell-side research analyst, you focus on providing buy and sell recommendations for publicly traded equities And then I was specifically looking at the oilfield services sector. And that when that ran its course, and I decided to try to step into the policy world, one thing or one introduction led to another, and I found myself at the Payne Institute. And we slowly put together this idea of creating, as Jim described it, it's called the Energy Finance Lab, with the express intent to try to nurture financial mechanisms and financial understanding to help with decarbonization efforts that relate to skills that are very pronounced at the Colorado School of Mines, which really means that we focus on things in the subsurface. So it's oil and gas related, it's CCS, carbon capture and storage related, looking at geothermal, and doing a lot now with critical mineral development as well. So I don't know if I guess I didn't totally answer your question there, but I had, my background even before that, the Wall Street gigs was more or less always related to financial analysis and the like. And so it's just something I've always found interesting and fairly powerful, just in terms of, sort of making things happen. And so that emphasis really doesn't change, as we'll talk about today for sure. A lot of what I try to focus on is the idea that, well, governments only have so much money or can only raise so much money, but you have to kind of activate the levers of capitalism if you really want to achieve that much more activity, that much more change in this case, and just to sort of make it durable.
So, Brad, you've already mentioned the Energy Finance Lab in the Payne Institute. Can you go into a little bit more detail about what you have been looking at and plan to look at through the Energy Finance Lab's capabilities and your ability to write and talk about these subjects?
Sure. So again, as you called out, and maybe I just touched on, a lot of the emphasis is on how to motivate private money and how to galvanize it. And so one way of answering your question is that we look at a couple of different financing mechanisms or bodies. Carbon markets is an important one, and I know we're going to talk about that a lot today. And then we look at sort of how do certain activities that are related to climate mitigation raise funding through markets. And I can hopefully take my own experience in equity and commodity markets and translate that to what do the carbon markets have to evolve to be to make that somewhat more effective. So that's one sort of cross-cutting example. We've also looked at tax policies, looked at potential financial mechanisms that might support the demand side of equations. So here I can amplify on that a little bit. If in the Biden administration, there were a number of policies passed around creating tax incentives for the supply side of things, as in to invest money to build capacity in whether it's renewable energy or to some degree even with mining and processing. There are other ways of approaching this as well. So there are demand support mechanisms. And so we look at some of those kinds of things, which again can be tax related. They might not be tax related, but look at those as well. And then we look specifically at commodity market development as well to think about things like green premia. Would someone be willing to pay more for a mineral that was mined in a so-called sustainable way versus one that was mined in a less sustainable way? And thinking about what it might take to develop incentives or to what incentives it might take to actually get markets like that to evolve.
Can you help us understand a little bit more about like the accounting world, how they try to, count carbon emissions?
Yeah, that is a tricky one, and it's certainly the more you sort of look, peel back the layers, the more complicated it really gets. But I suppose you could start with a relatively simple idea. The notion of looking at carbon and then standardizing around CO2 equivalents is an exactly attempt to take what is a very difficult problem and try to put it into a system that at least standardizes and therefore simplifies it somewhat. And so I guess I can introduce listeners, if in case they're not familiar with it, with a long time ago, a system was set up, was put in place to define certain types of emissions as it relates to an individual entity's business. So there's scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, and scope 3 emissions. And those really refer to the different boundaries around the organization. So scope 1 emissions of carbon, for example, mean that those are emissions that a company or an entity is producing as it makes its product. So it's deriving its own. So if it's burning oil or natural gas to fire a furnace or something like that, right? There are emissions associated with that, and they're firing that furnace to make their product. Scope 2 is the power that gets bought, or the emissions associated with the power that gets bought for the purposes of running their operations. And then scope 3 is the so-called value chain around the business. So what's the carbon intensity of the supplies that you're buying that feed into your manufacturing process? Or if the products that you make are used, and in so using them, you emit carbon, then what are those emissions? And so it encompasses a much wider frame. And so having set up those definitions, now you have the challenge of just trying to account for them. And that's not at all easy to do. Even for the most narrow, that scope 1, that can be somewhat challenging. But certainly as you get broader and further afield, having the wherewithal or having your partners track all of those emissions is very difficult. And so what we're seeing is an evolution. There's sort of two evolutions. One is critically important, which is the effort and the opportunity and the ability to measure your actual carbon footprint is evolving through tools. And then you're also seeing systems in place as companies almost toy with, well, how do we allocate? I don't know if you've had a cost, sort of in any sort of accounting class, how do you allocate costs? Well, you have the same issue with how do you allocate carbon emissions? Is it done on a revenue basis? Is it done on a volume basis? Is it done whatever? So there are lots of different systems which are still getting sorted out in terms of that. And it really is terribly important, especially because in the carbon world, we are essentially talking about often talking about comparing one company's emissions to another. So some of the choices they make, some of their investments that they make, and some of their ability to gauge their carbon, that all varies a lot. And therefore the data winds up varying a lot. It makes it difficult to work with. And all we really want to do is stick as close as we can to sort of simplifying and standardizing to allow us to make those comps. So it's evolving. How's that? Right. So there's a lot of different pieces that continue to evolve.
Absolutely. And you mentioned, just the allocation of everything, of all the funds, and where do we put the most attention and money to, right? So there's a lot of talk about, getting more private capital into the energy transition. So how does a clean energy business attract private funding? And what is the greenhouse gas protocol?
Okay, well, let's take those in reverse order. So the greenhouse gas protocol was actually instrumental in setting up those standards, those scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 that I talked about earlier. There were a number of other provisions that it talked about in terms of setting up frameworks, but that was really, I think, its biggest contribution. Now, in terms of your first question, I think you sort of have to answer that in a couple of ways. Fundamentally, and maybe durably, it has to be anchored in the same business principles as anything else. And so whether you're supporting economic returns via some sort of tax incentive, via some sort of government support or not, the project needs to pencil out, and the financial returns need to be there if you're really going to see that. At least that's the world that most of us live in, because that's the world that most people live in, right? That the economics have to be there. How the economics get there, you start with government, and whether there is a carbon tax or a carbon price, or tax incentives like we have done it in this country, all of those are essentially government support systems to help projects get along. In most cases, it isn't enough, but in some cases it is. But let's look at the renewable energy market. The private side is, of course, that you're selling the power that the windmill generates into some electricity grid. And so some combination of tax incentives plus the private sources of funding, which come from natural business, that's kind of how you spur that capital to move in that direction. In that example, you also have something which I think we're going to start to talk about more, which is renewable energy credits, which are a system that are supported by some government initiatives that say, yes, you can get value for that. But in some cases, there are also private decisions that companies make because they're trying very consciously to decarbonize or develop accounting systems to say, yes, our net emissions, including the benefit of using some of those renewable energy credits, or as we'll get to, carbon offsets, this is what our total picture looks like. And we are trying hard to lower our overall carbon footprint or encourage decarbonization in some other ways. That was a bit of a convoluted answer, but we can clarify more as we go. So
no, I think that made you clarified a lot. I guess another like follow-up question I had, of like all the scopes that you mentioned, with all the incentives that are currently in place, which of the scopes is, currently like the most feasible that can like, generate the most amount of like capital and have like more financial incentive, but also on the other hand, provides, a sufficient type of clean energy.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let me try it a couple ways, and we'll see what makes sense. So, I mentioned scope 1, 2, and 3, and kind of the concentric circles, right? So, scope 1 is presumably the items most in your control, and as innovation has developed more and more alternatives, as well as just a greater consciousness around, we're speaking in generalities because we're talking about so many different businesses and so many different products and everything else. But I guess the short way of thinking of it is, in general, scope 1 is the most manageable because, again, it's items within your control. And so if you can replace, it's probably not a great example, but if you can replace a very carbon intensive product with something that is not carbon intensive, then you're taking the fastest action towards decarbonization. Now, you could argue, I mentioned that scope 2 was buying power. And so to the extent that you're a large player, or to the extent that you have maybe sort of the capital wherewithal to do your own thing from a power perspective, you might be able to swap out or drive the swapping out of fossil fuel-based electricity generation in favor of renewable energy based, right? Clean energy based fossil. So scope 2, again, can be within your power if perhaps you have a little bit more heft. And certainly, the easiest example is to look at the tech sector, and you look at whether it's, well, any of them, Microsoft, Google, they're all trying very actively to have as much of the power, which is so critical to their operations, come from clean sources of energy as opposed to fossil energy. And so that's, and so by inference, then the hardest, again, is scope 3, because you're working with a supply chain, which for most companies can be very, very complicated. And by the way, pretty opaque. So it's not easy enough. You can't just lean on a couple of people to clean up their operations, so to speak. It's a much more involved process than that. And similarly, downstream, products emit if they emit. If you're driving cars, guess what, they emit. So so I suppose that's the easiest answer to your question, is that it's the closer you are to your own operations, the more it's within your control to decarbonize. It's just, I guess I'll mention before you move on, there are people generally refer to hard to abate sectors of the economy, which by their very nature are just more difficult to decarbonize than others. So you can point to the cement industry, which is so critical for all infrastructure building, as a good example of a difficult to abate sector, because the material going into the cement has a carbon footprint associated with it. And so there are a lot of technology efforts to try to change out that material. and the fact that you need massive, really hot furnaces, which right now are far more efficiently fired with fossil energy than with clean. And those both really raise the stakes in terms of what it would take to clean those up from a carbon emission standpoint.
Well, Brad, you brought up this idea of looking at carbon in different kind of ways. And I guess, from my science brain, I take a look at carbon and I can understand the chemistry. I can understand, you know, carbon intensity fuels or, processes. I can use my engineering brain and I look at carbon and I could see it as a fuel. I could see it as part of my product. From operations perspective, I could see it as emissions, piece of equipment I need to fix or whatever. But you're looking at this carbon as a financial mechanism, so or some sort. So can you explain just this concept? What is a carbon offset? How do you make a financial mechanism like a trading platform from abating carbon emissions?
Sure, sure. We may go back and forth a couple of times with it because there's a lot to cover. But in some ways, to try to keep it simple at first, the idea behind a carbon offset is that this notion of standardizing around the emission of one carbon dioxide ton or the global warming potential or impact of one carbon dioxide equivalent ton is essentially a collective effort to say, we're going to put value on that. We don't have to put a value, or I should say a cost on that, but we're all going to try. We're going to agree that we're going to do that. In principle, I guess our country recently has become a little bit more used to this idea of taking an idea that's not quite tangible and putting value on it, right? So a lot of the notion of crypto, a lot of the notion of meme coins, a lot of the notion of generating it and just having kind of a market deciding that it has value. And we've all laughed at some of the examples over the last few years of that process, but it's not dissimilar from a collective agreement to try to put a value on avoiding or removing 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalent because of the global warming impact of it. So once there is a decision to try to do that, then an ecosystem around, or many ecosystems around, saying, well, what value do we put on an activity that claims to do that? How do we think about the parameters that would give that value? And how do we compare those against other things? So what do I mean? There are now hundreds of different so-called climate mitigation activities that have followed a fairly prescriptive route to say, look, we did this, and as a result, there are 1,000 tons of CO2 that are not going to be emitted either this year or last year or in the future. And it cost us money to do that activity. So again, in case that's not clear, it's like Jim was talking about earlier, we're going to talk maybe about plugging oil wells, right? And if you plug abandoned oil wells, methane gas is not going to leak out of it. And otherwise it would have. And so you can take that methane and you can translate it into a CO2 equivalent from a global warming potential standpoint. The science is pretty readily available on that. And you can say, all right, what value do I put on that activity? And you're going to compensate the project developer for having invested its money into that climate mitigation activity. But again, an ecosystem has developed to consider, well, is it absolutely guaranteed that it's going to avoid the emission of that methane in this case, or that carbon? Does it have other benefits in addition that I might place a value on? Like there's other forms of leaks that won't happen, or perhaps it helped employ people in an area that needed employment, or other sort of social benefits. You can think about those. What are the odds that it's permanent? Some activities are good for 10 years or good for 50 years, but not permanent. What value do I put on the idea that it's never going to leak versus just that it shouldn't leak for 10 years or 20 years, right? So you can start to think about a lot of different parameters And once you do that, all of a sudden you have lots of different products. It's not just that you have carbon or carbon avoidance, I should say, but you have lots of different effective products within these carbon credits. And a market can start to build where some people want one, but not something else, and someone else wants a different carbon product. And next thing you know, you have something, well, that frankly looks a lot like a stock market, that you have choices and you can pick from the projects or the activities within those and decide what pricing is warranted for those.
And I guess these markets have been around longer than I might have guessed, and they kind of started with people's looking at forests and deforestation, reforestation, essentially the ability of trees to take carbon out of the atmosphere, right?
They did. They did. Is right. I assume there were a handful of some other types of projects as well, but back in the 1990s, and then firmed up in the Kyoto Protocol, your point is established, and there were the initial rules around crediting. It's actually kind of interesting because, at least I find it interesting. I guess we'll see if you guys do. Um, the initial premise was very like pure economist. It was like, well, if we want to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, we should encourage the cheapest way of doing it first. And we should support that, right? That would be the most efficient. If we're shooting for, you know, X millions of tons, or at this point, it's tens of millions of tons, but whatever of activity benefiting activities that would avoid carbon emissions, wouldn't it be smart to spend as little money as possible to achieve that effect? And that was a lot of the initial premise. So rather than decarbonizing your cement kiln, you should sponsor the, you should sponsor the either the restoration or even just keeping a given part of forests healthy, right? Because deforestation is also contributes to global warming. So if we can avoid deforestation, then we're contributing to a solution. And so a lot of the first principles were around efficiency. That's been turned around more recently because there is a perception that someone is cheating, right? They're just looking for the cheapest way to not to get credit for not emitting, as opposed to addressing their own operations. But 25 years ago, when things were really getting going in earnest, it was a little bit of the opposite psychology. And of course, part of the problem was that people took advantage of it. Not all the projects were of high quality and didn't actually protect the forest the way they were going to protect the forest. But at least in principle, there was a much more, again, I'll sort of say pure economic kind of approach to the thought process.
What are some of the major challenges that we see in establishing a voluntary carbon market? And how does this differ from like a compliance market?
Well, I guess I started to hit on one, so I can come back to it. The fact is, in a voluntary market, there's sort of no one entity to say this is absolutely good or this is absolutely bad. In principle, all you need to have is a developer that proposes an idea and can represent fairly what it's done. And you need a buyer on the other end to say, works for me, I'll buy those, right? So there really, in a sense, are no quote rules. What has happened in some of the fits and starts in the market is that there has been public outcry against some of the rules that were set up. And so there's been kind of a shaming process saying, this activity really didn't do anything for the environment or the climate. And therefore those credits had no value in this world. And so a company claiming that they had spent a lot of money in order to protect the environment really shouldn't be able to make that claim. And in fact, they shouldn't really be buying those credits. And so what the voluntary market has had to undergo is a series of integrity efforts, I guess you saw, where you generally take experts from within the community that have been looking at things for a long time, and they say, well, in our general experience, there are ways to ensure that the projects have merit and do what they claim that they're going to do. And so they've tried to establish standards, and again, kind of using like a public honor system to say, we'll issue a check and that should give you an element of comfort. Or there's some other things that have come into place, like credit rating agency comparable things where they're folks that are actually rating these projects for the likelihood that they will achieve the climate benefit that they claim, right? So, but the point is that buyers, because of that process, and maybe just because they want to do good anyway, they need help in getting guidance that the claim benefits are actually going to be achieved. And so some of the challenges is simply, how do you establish and maintain the integrity of the claim, because it can otherwise be pretty hard to check. The compliance markets inherently are a little bit different. You still fall back on maybe what was your first question, which is, how reliably can a company report and even account for their own emissions, and how does one think about that? But within the context of that, compliance systems tend to work with, okay, you're emitting 1 million tons a year, steel provider, you need to get that down to 600,000 in a couple of years. And if you cannot, you're going to have to buy somebody else's, essentially going to have to buy somebody else's emissions credit. So it overlays sort of a financial burden, but also an opportunity through this notion of emissions allowances, which are shared in a marketplace. The activities, therefore, are much more constrained to what the business does. That steel mill has to establish that it installed XYZ equipment and therefore is emitting less carbon. And so the aggregate carbon emission for the steel mill has gone down to 600,000 the way it was supposed to. It doesn't allow for protecting for, generally speaking, I mean, there are things around the edges, but generally speaking, it's much more focused on that scope one. It doesn't really allow for protecting forests and having cook stoves and all of the other of the dozens and dozens of different activities that we're talking about in the VCM. So.
Yeah, it really is a balance, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting experiment, I guess you'd say, in kind of this collective goodwill, both from the seller and the buyer perspective, even though the sellers are clearly trying to make some money at it. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess in a market system, if there's a seller of something and a buyer that's interested in that, and they can agree on a price or value, then you can have a market, right? That's all the kind of elements. Then it gets a lot more complicated. Whether it's my old comic book collection or maybe the partial ownership of a piece of art or something like that. I guess almost anything can be that kind of commodity. But a question here is about for all the stakeholders involved, and you've got more and more of them. How do you build trust and transparency? And you've been talking some about, there's always a cheater who'll take advantage of a market, or there's always questions about whether or not it's permanent or the volume or whatever it is. But the whole idea that it seems that these markets work on trust, and that trust is not so easy to accomplish sometimes, because I may not have that many pieces of and that many comic books that I now own, so I don't hold it in my hand or something. So some issues about this evolving idea of building trust and transparency.
Sure. I mean, there are a few ways. I like the comic book analogy, so we can work with that. So if your collection was relatively small and if your marketplace was relatively local, then you could be sitting at a table outside your house or at the farmer's market, and someone could walk up and inspect every aspect of that comic book collection if it was available. And so they could see how yellowed the pages were, if you had ever read it, and whatever other things factor into deriving a price and a value for your collection. I think you can take those ideas and say, well, of course, it doesn't work so easily if you're trying to protect forests, 10,000 miles away from your house. and you're a buyer. And so how do you bring some degree of transparency around all of the parameters that one cares about as a buyer? Well, you can rely on third parties to do verification work. I mentioned before that there are essentially rating agencies that have now come up that to some degree do the due diligence for you. Principle, they might do some of the due diligence for you. Some of them overlay their own technology. So let's stick with the forest example, right? They have access to satellite data, which can look at forest cover. And it even gets more fancy than that because they can somehow interpolate or something that you can see the ground cover underneath the trees, even though the trees are covered, right, or covering their access to it. But there are ways to overlay technology to try to see even more so. Presumably, all of the documentation for both the baseline assumption, which is just a sort of a fancy way of saying what would have happened if there were no project, right? What's the baseline? How fast would that forest have degraded or been cut down or something, as well as the actual updates on how well the project's doing. All of that can be now put into platforms. We have access to technology. So all of that can be put into some platform so that a buyer can review it and verify that it has those qualities. And so I guess what I'm leaning towards are the sophistication, mostly technology driven, but to some degree that an ecosystem of other actors can do to try to verify that these things are in fact being done as promised. But it's difficult. I mean, it really is difficult. If it's predicated on physics to look at satellite data and do appropriate analysis of what that translates to for tree cover and therefore how much CO2 absorption there is, there's probably more than one analysis that can be done. I mean, Jim, you're very familiar. If I shift that a little bit, if you're very familiar with methane, right, from your oil and gas background, and you understand that when methane is emitted from a leak somewhere in an oil and gas well site, depending on which way the wind is blowing, your ability to measure and understand just how much methane is emitted changes, right? You almost have to have sites. Presumably you'd have to have sensors everywhere, right? And they'd be constantly gathering information, and you'd be kind of somehow assessing all of the different sensors picking up, and you'd be doing really, really fancy math to try to assess that, right? So it's difficult. I'm not trying to say that all the processes are so difficult, and there are other ways to address it. But to the extent that you can understand what it takes to provide sort of an accurate assessment of the benefits of that project, then you can relay it to others. And presumably that translates to value, that much more easily. So
I think, again, if your buyer and seller are both comic book lovers, then there's a common vocabulary and a common idea of, what Spider-Man 214 is really kind of a value and all about. But
sure.
if in terms of what we were talking about here, in terms of these emission models, you're also kind of crossing disciplines. You say that, somebody may really understand methane and where the fugitive emissions may come from onshore oil and gas or whatever. You not only need a lot of sensors, you need a weather model to know which way the wind's blowing, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
but that's on one hand on the kind of the seller side, but the buyer may be somebody who knows absolutely nothing about your oil and gas or your forestry management or whatever it is. They just are in one of these situations where they made a promise to go a certain kind of limit on their operations, and they've exceeded it, and now they need to buy these offsets to get back in line with whatever their commitment is, legal or from stakeholders or whatever. So
Mm-hmm.
sometimes to build this trust, you have a problem of even one side understanding the other. Isn't that true?
I think that's true. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that in the voluntary market there really are probably hundreds of different activities. And so you are, that implies a tremendous strain on a buyer to sort through a lot of very different and maybe very complicated things with different data and different reporting, because things are not all standardized, because you're talking about different marketplaces and different methodology writers and different standard setters in general. And there's it's hard. It's hard. That many companies that are the buyers, right, that have the resources to really do the due diligence as thoroughly as you might think they need to address all of these different things. So without having spent a lot of time with the buyers, I mean, you can imagine why they would hone in on a couple of types of projects or a couple of regions or a couple of things that are truly relevant to them that they can feel that they understand. And rather than look at dozens and dozens of different potential activities, you kind of center on something that feels like it makes sense to you, either because of what you do in your business or, again, where you operate. And so you care. So let's just stick with the forestry preservation example, right? If you have natural resource needs in Latin America, you might look at Latin America forestry preservation, right? Just as kind of a logical, we're giving back to that community. We care about the aggregate community, and this is one way of expressing that. But it is really, to your point, to your question, it is complicated, and it's a lot of work. And that's one of the challenges for the notion of the carbon markets scaling up, is how do we make all of that fact checking? How do we make all of that clearer and simpler so that someone can just step in and say, I don't have to understand everything. I can be confident that others have done the fact checking and the diligence and have said, yep, this works. And I've even, I'm able to verify it. And of course, there are third parties that come in and say, yep, we're doing the checking for you. And for the low price of this, I'll vouch for your credit. But they don't necessarily have a lot of skin in that game, right? There's no repercussions if they do something wrong. And so that only goes so far, I think, in terms of convincing some buyers. So the point is, it's tricky.
Yes, a credit rating organization would give Costa Rica a higher grade than Brazil, maybe if you're on your Latin American forestry example.
Hmm. Sure. For reasons that have to do with prior projects and, perceptions of adherence and government involvement and everything else. Yeah.
Governance, reputation, all those kind of
mm-hmm.
important things to build trust, but not really something I can measure and put in a box.
Yeah. Tricky.
It's pretty clear, what private investors would want to see in looking at, like green tech startups. But what are private investors looking for in specifically carbon offset markets?
I guess it depends on the investor. But let's start at the very high end, because that's kind of a fun end to start at. So there are a good handful, it's probably more than a handful, of projects that are bringing innovative technology to bear to pull carbon dioxide, say, out of the atmosphere and either store it underground permanently or do something interesting with it. Without limiting the universe entirely, these are often referred to as direct air capture. Direct air capture technology is really expensive right now, but those project developers have done a decent job, I'd say, in convincing mostly very rich tech companies, but still convincing companies to spend $500, $600 per ton or more on a pre-purchase basis, so that over the next several years, as these plants ramp, they will buy the credits as they are issued. So you measure how much is stored coming out of it and sell those credits, but you've already pre-sold them to Microsoft. That's at the very high end of the market. And the presumption is that the tech companies, or whatever, the buyers that are interested it's attractive because it's reduction. So we're taking CO2, we're not just avoiding it from being emitted in the future, but it's sitting in the atmosphere today and we're getting rid of it. and they are promoting new technology. So they're saying, we understand that we are spending more on a per ton basis than this activity will likely require 5 years from now, but we're helping to promote development of the new technology, and we feel good about that. So that's kind of at that high end of the spectrum. Others are more interested, if you will, in volume, right? And so you say, let me find a high quality, high integrity project of which there are millions of credits today available. And if I spend $10 or $15 per ton, so dramatically less than the direct air capture option, but I'm going to buy a lot more of those. And so therefore my impact today is greater because that's important to me. So the only consistency really is that it's about making an impact at some point in the relatively near future, right? That I obviously with direct air capture, the hope is that you move down that learning curve quite quickly. And so that by 2030 or by 2035, there's an ability to scale that and it only costs $100 a ton. It's still expensive, but it's much more manageable number. Whereas presumably for forestry, preservation or afforestation or something, it isn't necessarily getting a whole lot cheaper. You're just trying to, boom, let's get this thing scaled. And there are some examples of, for example, jurisdictional scale, where you take a region of a country or the whole country, and there are commitments made, and therefore many, many millions of tons of credits, or I should say many, many millions of credits are being issued on that basis. And you're helping, oh, I'm sorry, I guess that's another thing. You're sort of, in those cases, you're helping a country with resources to protect its ecosystems and protect its forests. So there are some social benefits as well as just the climate ones.
Good, thank you.
Well, Brad, it's really been a pleasure having you on the episode of the Future of Energy today. You helped us all kind of see carbon emissions as a commodity that can be traded and bought and sold and have a financial value to something which is a kind of usually considered some sort of activity or part of your supply chain or product or whatever it is. So you've opened our eyes to a financial mechanism that hopefully is going to be attractive to some, and is yet another way to bring private capital into this energy transition. So before we leave, I just want to give you a chance. Is there anything in our short discussion here today, that we might have missed, that you think is important for our audience to also consider as they're thinking about carbon emissions as a financial thing?
I suppose the only thing that really comes to mind, although if, as you've noticed, my answers meander, so maybe I'll think of more as I go. But the only thing that really comes to mind at first is one of the things that concerns me about the language used in especially the voluntary markets today is in this desire for integrity and high quality. We do seem to have forgotten that there is an element of uncertainty that will pervade all of this. That it will, for many, many activities, if not all of them, it will probably be hard to nail down exactly the climate benefit that you have. And I fear sometimes as I read stuff that there is a lack of tolerance for that idea. You certainly want the industry to strive for as much accuracy and accountability and integrity as you can. But I do fear that sometimes we get lost in the fact that there will always be uncertainty because there will be a counterfactual. There will be a baseline that you will not see, for example. And so I guess it's a plea as buyers consider this, or as any observers of the markets consider it, to understand that we're trying to minimize uncertainty, but we will not eliminate uncertainty. And to accept the idea that that's not so different than most other markets, right? We clearly live in worlds of uncertainty in the stock market as well. Or if you think about in the oil and gas industry, there is a constant, there are assumptions and estimates laid on top of value every day, um, that are surely wrong. I mean, they're wrong to some degree, but not necessarily wrong to the point where it undermines the value of the asset. And so hopefully we can, in that quest for integrity, and I know this is a bit wonkish and all that and out there, but you ask and so I answer that, hopefully we can kind of keep our eyes on that a little bit and accept finding reasonable boundaries within it. But otherwise, I am really hopeful that because of the strides made in sort of setting standards, because of the strides that are being made in terms of the technology and therefore accessibility, and therefore the demands for availability of information and transparency of information and all of that, that the market can find its footing and really grow and be the tool that it seems like it should be able to be to galvanize a lot of this private finance.
Well, again, thank you. And just to ask our audience if they'd like to learn more, to check out the Energy Finance Labs, part of the Payne Institute, and your many good articles with students on a lot of topics, and your presentations at these conferences, trying to get everybody to understand that 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent might be 1.15, but it's still worth buying.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I appreciate the plug. So great. No, I think that's it. So thank you very much. I appreciate the chance to talk with you both today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
As a production engineer in San Joaquin Valley, in Central California. And that's where I really learned the basics of our oil and gas production industry, because I was actually had a full-time role versus being a summer hire. And that's where things were launched. And even though that was my first assignment, I probably learned more in that role than the whole rest of the roles I had, mainly because I was able to learn the fundamentals of how oil and gas production works, and all the nuances and what works and what doesn't work. And my 35 years at Chevron took me to 2 other locations in California, Alaska, back to California, then to New Orleans for the Gulf of Mexico offshore experience, and even acquisitions and divestitures. And from there, I went to Houston, where I ended up spending more time than any other location for the operations and technology roles across the central U.S. Definitely. So I was in the I field role when that happened, and that was my last role, as I mentioned before. And we had an opportunity to partner with the Petroleum Engineering Department at USC. And there was a couple of connections between upper Chevron management and USC management. And through the discussions, they decided to develop a joint center and centered around smart oil field technologies. And CSOF was launched, and what CSOF stood for was a Center for Interactive Smart Oil Field Technologies. And we enjoyed an 11-year run with that center. It was co-managed by Dr. Ashagi, the head of the Petroleum Engineering Department, and myself, being the head of iField. And it was one of the most enjoyable times, I guess, for my overall, because that role also took me into the international areas as well. So the learning curve was steep, but very, very enjoyable, and still can benefit from that today. And our relationship was so close, Dr. Shaggy and I, that I looked out for USC more than Chevron, and he looked out for Chevron more than USC. And that kind of balance worked well for us to be really joined at the hip and co-managing things in an enjoyable manner. And the most rewarding and successful part of my interaction with USC has been the last one, where we've been working on workforce development for the energy industry.
Well, the topic for this episode is the next generation of energy workforce, which fits right into your current, kind of consulting effort collaboration with USC. And as part of that, we understand that you recently kind of prepared a paper on this topic for the Western Region SPE conference coming up here in within a few weeks. Um, from that paper, what were your conclusions? What are the major challenges in recruiting, training, retraining, retaining the next generation of workforce? You had a long career, just like I did in the oil and gas industry.
Mhm.
What do you see the highlights of working for this industry that might attract that next generation workforce?
There's a number of them. It was um, an interesting journey to get to publishing the paper because it was an elapsed 12 months of research on from trade journals, other articles, people, um, and really trying to understand where we were, where we have been, where are we now, and where is it likely to go. And as you probably could imagine, it's been pretty dynamic over the last year. And so with all that research, I just put it together and categorized it. Got a lot of feedback and interaction from my colleagues. And the bottom line is, when you look at the forecast, the needs of energy for the world, it's only going to keep going up. And I might jump to the bottom line to kind of set the stage. And in my view, and a lot of people's views now, pitting different types of energies against each other just got to stop, because we need them all, and they all may not be enough until new things are developed. So that's kind of the story. That's the kind of the final paper conclusion is we need it all. There's a lot of opportunity, and Generation Z is the main feeder to the future of the workforce as of today. And most of Generation Z's knowledge is pretty low around the energy industry. So, but the little bit we've done to interact with that age group, the light bulbs come on. Their eyes light up, and they understand what's really true about the industry and what it can afford for them. And we've had both on the engineering side, good discussions at USC, and we've engaged the Los Angeles Technical Trade Center right by USC, who crank out skilled laborers and all the kinds of different trades, and that's been rewarding. And there's a lot more out there now in the public that the traditional get out of high school, go to university, slug it out for the career there, come out into the workforce, and with debt, most likely. And a good percentage of the Generation Zs from surveys we looked at and presented in the paper are thinking that's maybe not what I want to do. And the skilled labor force is a very compelling way to go.
Thank you so much for joining us for the future of energy. Special thanks to each of our guests today and to our technical wizard, Abhi, for his important contributions to this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast so you can automatically get access to all our new episodes. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts.